So you've taken an online personality test. It's quite possible you went on Google, searched in personality type test or what have you, and picked the first result that showed up. And it's quite possible that first result you clicked on is none other than the infamous 16 personalities test. For your sake, I hope not. Not because the test is bad per se, you understand, but rather because it has nothing whatsoever to do with cognitive functions, and therefore it should not be using MBTI codes. And you can of course find more information on the dilemma that has resulted from this in this video here. But whatever test you decided to click on first, you filled in the questions, you had a nice time for 10 minutes, and then you received a result. And I'd say about 50% of people would just take that result at face value. This isn't a criticism, it's quite reasonable to assume that whoever's creating these tests must be advanced experts in this particular field, and that this particular field must be scientifically valid, because why else would it be so popular? But maybe you're a bit more skeptical, maybe you take a slightly more scientific approach. Over the course of a year or a few years, you keep going back to the test and then you decide to pick whatever result it was that you most consistently got. And yes, absent accumulated confirmation bias, it's quite possible you have a more accurate reading on your type as a result. But there's still one big problem that remains. The problem is tests do not work. Unless you are in that lucky 30 to 50% of the population for whom tests do actually elicit some kind of accuracy, you have wasted your time. Or maybe that's a bit unfair. After all, tests are, well, first of all, fun to do, and secondly, they could be argued to be an effective self-referencing tool. What do I mean by that? Well, nothing more than answering questions about your own personality, your behavior, and your cognition. You are placed in a state of relative objectivity about yourself. Certain types, more than others, will very much benefit from this particular opportunity for reflection. But in terms of receiving, knowing, and understanding your personality type, or cognitive type as I prefer to say, chances are after doing these tests repeatedly as your sole means of elucidating your cognitive type, you are no closer to finding your type than you were at square one. So if you're still with me so far, I'm now going to present to you the 5 reasons why tests across the board do not work. They cannot be relied upon for determining your type. As human beings, we tend to be pretty binary animals. We tend to always want there to be one single answer why something is bad and one single answer why something is good, but the fact is, it's never that easy. And in this video, I'm going to be exploring the various facets that contribute to the general inefficiency of online personality tests. The first problem is rather simple. Tests rely on self-reporting. They very much rely on you, the participant, to have sufficient objectivity as to be able to reliably state exactly how you will act in any given hypothetical scenario, or indeed how you will feel in any given hypothetical scenario. And yeah, there are many people walking around on this planet who have an incredible objectivity, who don't have an inflated ego, who don't have a false perception of self, and who aren't in the midst of an identity crisis. Well, first of all, these people are generally less likely to take an online test than people who are less certain about who they are. And secondly, they're relatively rare. Most people cannot accurately self-report. Maybe their accuracy will be about 70 to 80%. But generally speaking, we don't know ourselves nearly as much as we think we do. And you may very well think before going into a test, well, I'm not that objective about myself. I don't fully trust my ability to answer these questions accurately. And therefore I'm going to undertake this test in a group setting or with my partner, with somebody I trust. Well, this is going to be just as bad, because the people you trust, the people you love, the people who care about you, fair enough, they will know a lot of things about you that you do not. But chances are you will also know a lot of stuff about yourself that they do not. So this is just trading one form of inaccuracy for another one. And yes, it may very well be possible to rely on other people's input for answering the questions you are uncertain about, while answering independently of other people the questions you are certain about. Firstly, getting the balance right is probably more trouble than it's actually worth. And secondly, most people aren't aware of their own lack of objectivity. But the general lack of objectivity we as human beings have about ourselves is only one side of this self-reporting equation. Because yes, while we as participants of this test may very well have a certain level of bias, and oftentimes conflated ego, or heck, even deflated ego, there is also an extraordinary amount of bias in the questions themselves. What do I mean by this? Well, if you examine any given personality test, you may very well find a lot of these questions are very much weighted in favor of a certain answer. And this will very much be culture specific as well, because some cultures value certain persuasions, certain temperaments more than others. But But across the board, if a human being was presented with a question that asks them to what degree do they rely more on logic or their feelings, how many people, whatever their actual temperament, whatever their actual type, again, answer they rely more on their feelings. And while the questions pertaining to an intuitive versus sensing score tend to be less biased than the other ones, generally speaking, a lot of the questions that pertain to intellect and creativity are heavily slanted in favor of intuition. And again, the implications here are absolutely ludicrous. Sensors can be just as creative, insightful, and intellectual as intuitive personalities. And the problem doesn't stop here either. We live at the moment in a society, in a world even, that favours conscientiousness. And as such, people are automatically programmed with a bias in favour of a judging score. I am an individual who can take control of my life. I am an individual who can get things done. I can be relied upon. How many people are going to answer questions in a way contrary to the idealized version of themselves, to the version of themselves they were expected to be by society? And this all leads me neatly to the problem with the four dichotomies. Dichotomies are essentially the introversion versus extroversion, intuition versus sensing, thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perceiving. They are a staple component of MBTI, and they can be relied upon to about 50%, which is to say, not a lot, to determine the cognitive functions of an individual. Don't get me wrong, I actually have a lot of respect for the four dichotomies, because it is through these dichotomies that MBTI was able to assign behavioral traits to cognitive functions. But on the whole, I cannot stress enough that the four dichotomies cannot be relied upon to determine your cognitive functions. And now I'm going to explore why. First of all, let's take the introversion versus extroversion spectrum. Whether your behavior is more introverted or extroverted in nature is only very loosely correlated with your dominant function. You can have an extroverted dominant function and be incredibly introverted by societal standards. And many people who have had an introverted dominant function, think Bruce Lee, Arnold Schwarzenegger, are incredibly outgoing and extroverted individuals, because your behavior can be in one category while your actual cognition can be in another. This happens across the board. This is why so many ENTPs mistype consistently as INFJs. But now let's take my personal favorite, the sensing versus intuition dichotomy. Why is it my favorite? It's because the implication of this dichotomy is absolutely and fundamentally ridiculous. The idea that half of the 16 types, yes, half, actually favor sensing, for example, over intuition, and intuition over sensing, is fundamentally flawed. So many quote-unquote sensors have an incredibly well-developed intuitive dialogue, whether it's external or internal. So many, and I stress this, so many intuitive types have an incredibly well-developed sensing function. And the idea that sensing types are automatically, as a default, less intellectually inclined, less creative, less insightful than intuitive types is grossly offensive. And it has resulted in a development of a gross prejudice against people who receive a sensing result. Because these people are automatically narrow-minded, within the box, uncreative, generally, for lack of a better term, boring. But in reality, it just doesn't work like this. So many sensors are more insightful and more innovative than intuitives. So many intuitives are much more grounded in concrete reality and pragmatic in nature than sensors. You cannot use this dichotomy. This dichotomy cannot and should not be relied upon, and I personally find it the most inaccurate of the four. Not because some people aren't more sensing, not because some people aren't more intuitive, but that your cognition itself, your cognitive functions, your actual cognitive type, has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you will be on one side of the sensing spectrum or the other. I'll say this again. Intuitive types can be sensors, and sensors can be intuitive types. ISFPs, ESFPs, ESFJs, ESTJs can oftentimes be more intuitive than ENFJs, INFPs, the list goes on. It is this dichotomy and the prejudices that have gone alongside it that I believe to be the greatest contributing factor to why people mistype in the first place. And now let's take the thinking versus feeling dichotomy. Again, I have a problem with this. Not only does this dichotomy contribute to the growing prejudice against subjective reasoning, but it also makes an absolutely ridiculous assertion. And this assertion is that feeling types are less thinking than thinking types, and thinking types are less feeling than feeling types. And it is very much pervasive of what is, in my opinion, an incredibly clunky and rigid understanding of cognitive functions based upon this list of preferences. the idea that one person uses one function more than another one. And resulting from this, there must be a couple of functions at the bottom of a stack that barely see the light of day. But I digress. The problem I have with this dichotomy is not a sociological one. It's simply the fact that it's not accurate. There were plenty of people, I stress this, plenty of people who correctly receive an F in their MBTI given acronym who are much more objectively logical than they are subjectively logical. And so many people who receive a T within their MBTI given acronym, reflective of their actual cognitive functions, are completely and utterly driven by their emotions. And logic is doing nothing more than to justify the emotions this person is feeling. This is a feeling type. But this again, just as with sensing versus intuition, the degree to which a person is more objectively logical or more subjectively logical than another has got nothing to do with the cognitive functions they possess. There are plenty of INFJs who favour an objective codec over a subjective one, and there are plenty of INTJs who favour a subjective codec over their objective one. Because the fact is, everybody is a thinker and everybody is a feeler, and the degree to which one person is one or the other cannot be categorized or surmised by the thinking-feeling dichotomy. Because the thinking-feeling dichotomy is intrinsically linked to cognitive functions which have very little overlap with the person's actual score within this particular continuum. And now let us visit the judging versus perceiving dichotomy. I don't really have a problem with this dichotomy insofar as I recognize that some people are more conscientious than other people. But again, this has very little to do with cognitive functions. The degree to which a person is conscientious throughout their life is only very marginally correlated with their underlying cognitive functions. Generally, in my observations, extroverted feeling dominants are much more likely to receive a judging score than any other type because they are so often instilled with the values of their relative community, and oftentimes the way that people are brought up these days is to be conscientious. Furthermore, extroverted feeling dominants tend to want to meet the expectations of other people, and again, this will drive conscientiousness. But aside from that particular exception, generally, a person's cognitive functions has very little to do with whether or not they will receive a perceiving or judging score. There are plenty of INTJs and INFJs who will receive INFP and INTP results, and there are plenty of ENFPs and ENTPs who will receive a judging score. Because the degree to which a person is conscientious is only very loosely correlated with their underlying cognitive functions. And yes, some people's dominant functions, or indeed authority functions, are judging functions, aka codec functions. But just because a person values rationalization and order over the perception of new novelties doesn't mean they behave in a less conscientious way. And concerning reason number 4, I've actually already addressed this particular issue within my Why So Many People Think They Are an INFJ video. But nonetheless, I will brush over it again here. And this reason is thus: many websites, including but in no way limited to 16personalities.com, essentially piggyback MBTI codes on top of the Big 5 score. The Big 5, while indeed an excellent model for determining a person's behavioural traits, which by the way can fluctuate across a year, has absolutely nothing to do with cognitive functions, and it should not be used to elucidate the cognition behind a person's behavioural traits. But nonetheless, many websites like 16personalities.com attempt to do this. So when you receive a result from tests such as this, do not assume you have the corresponding cognitive functions to the MBTI code you've just been given, because the MBTI code within this particular instance means nothing more than the degree to which you are introverted or extroverted according to a Big 5 paradigm, which is different from MBTI, the degree to which you are open within the Big 5, the degree to which you are disagreeable, and the degree to which you are conscientious. And while I would very much concede that the conscientious score of Big 5 does indeed have a very strong overlap with the judging score, as I explored in reason 3 as to why the dichotomies are not effective, whether or not a person receives a conscientious or judging score has very little to do with their cognitive functions. And after all of that, there remains yet one more reason why tests do not work. And this is the Barnum effect. And this is a psychological phenomenon that is observed within the personality typing field. And it is one of the contributing reasons as to why MBTI is in many ways seen as more of a pseudoscience. Because when people are given a list of universal human traits, for as long as these human traits are made out and written in such a way as to seem individual to the person reading it, the person subsequently believes that what are in fact these universal human traits are in some way unique to them. And then they proclaim to the sky that for the first time in their life they feel understood. Well, yeah, you feel understood, but that's because you've just been presented with these attributes that make you human. They don't make you unique. They don't make you a certain personality type. They don't fit you within this narrow niche within society. No, they simply illuminate to you the way in which you are a human being after all. So let's say you do a 16 personalities test. You get a result. Within this result, you will find a list of highly ubiquitous human traits. Yes, some of these results will be unique to the certain personality type, but more often than not, many of the statements about your character you receive within any given type description can very much be applied to other personality types. But they are written in such a way as to make it unique to your type. And so oftentimes what these type descriptions do is they divide up all of these various universal human traits and they assign some universal traits to some types and not to others. But it does mean that no matter what result you get, chances are if you read another type description, which is seemingly contrary to your own, you will find many things within that description you resonate with just as much as that of your own description. But there's a highly pernicious undercurrent to this entire thing. Because the fact is, you have many people who profit from the creation of highly popular typing websites such as 16personalities.com, from making every single type description as vague and as ubiquitous and indeed Barnum effect employing as they possibly can. This is because they want to ensure that no matter what result a person receives, they are happy with that result, and therefore they are more likely to share the result and the website they got the result from with their friends, with their family, with their co-workers. And therefore, with the understanding that this test is not going to be 100% reliable, heck, it isn't even going to be over 50% reliable, the savvy businessman will take measures to ensure that no matter what result they get, they feel this result defines who they are. And they subsequently proclaim for the first time in their life they feel understood. And yeah, of course, let's not blow this out of proportion. I think it's fair to say that there are some type descriptions on any given website that are the exact opposite in every single way to another one. But when you are employing the Barnum effect, you only want to do so to the extent that is necessary to ensure that whenever a person of a certain temperament takes a test, they will receive, let's say, 3 to 4 different type results that equally describe who the person is. So yeah, if you are answering a list of questions sufficiently as to describe a gregarious and outgoing individual, then the Barnum effect will be employed to ensure that whether or not you get an ENFP, ESFP, ESTP result, you will still feel like you've been told exactly who you are. And if you take a test to describe yourself as a highly sensitive, introverted idealist, the Barnum effect will then be employed within a few types again, let's say the INFP, INFJ, ISFP, to ensure that no matter which of these 3 results you get, you'll subsequently break down into tears and proclaim to the high heavens that for the first time in your life you feel understood. And this is a major reason why so many people are walking around mistyped and yet simultaneously certain of their type, because they have not so much been given an individualized type description as they have a set of universal human traits that correspond to their particular temperament. And hopefully now at the end of this video I've now presented to you a compelling argument as to why tests can in no circumstances be relied upon as the sole means of determining your type. And while with no hint of vested interest, I will always recommend to people to engage with a type service with somebody they trust to determine what the type is, alongside independent study of cognitive functions, I will be presenting in a follow-up video various means by which you can more reliably determine your actual cognitive functions, your actual cognitive type, and hopefully escape this never-ending rabbit hole of personality tests. And that concludes the video, so thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. You are awesome. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. It really does help the channel grow, develop, and reach new audiences. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to click that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it to stay notified of future content. And yes, whenever I get to this point in the video, I do tend to speak too fast. But my rate of speech here is in no way negatively correlated with the degree to which I appreciate your support. Just a reminder to everyone, I do have a dedicated type service if you're ever uncertain about your type. And if you haven't already checked out the CPT ebook, I definitely recommend you do so. So thanks again for watching, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.